Now, this is a comment I just got, and overall, I'm going to talk about should you rent a car in 2025 to drive for Uber and Lyft? Being honest, because I hate YouTubers that ramble on, I'm going to give you a short answer and then get into a very long answer. Being honest, it depends. Now, I know there's nothing worse than an ambiguous answer, but it does depend on how you drive, when you drive, your schedule, and a lot of other factors. So let's get into these 7 points. Let's get into the long answer. I'm going to talk about 7 things you really have to know and really have to consider when it comes to renting a car to drive for Uber or Lyft in 2025. Number 1, the cost. How much does it cost? There are a lot of different factors when it comes to your credit score, what cars are available, what car you pick, and a lot more. But overall, you're looking at about spending $100 to $300 per week, or let's say $400 to $1,200 a month. Keep that in mind. That is how much it costs when it comes to renting a car. And there are different car companies out there like Hire Car and other ones. There are different rental car companies now that kind of are associated with Uber and Lyft, or other kind of third-party companies that are not directly associated, but say, hey, rent with us and you can drive for Uber and Lyft with our vehicle. But keep in mind, you're looking at about anywhere between $100 and $300 a week on average, but that could even be more expensive depending on what car you pick and the specific terms of the agreement. Number 2, full-time versus part-time, and overall, I'm going to talk about the ROI, the return on the investment. Because as you can imagine, if you're spending, let's say $100, $200, $300, let's round it, let's say $200. You're spending $200 per week to rent the car. If you can be driving part-time, you can be driving, well, a little bit here and there, you could potentially lose money. If, let's say you make, I put that in quotation marks, $180 in a week because you're driving here and there, you're driving part-time, well, technically you made or really lost $20. You made negative 20. That is something to keep in mind. Now, I know this sounds like very captain obvious on this video, but I have to mention it because I do feel like when it comes to renting a car with Uber and Lyft, it is kind of, I hate to say it, all or nothing. Now, to talk about a personal example, I never rented a car to drive for Uber and Lyft. I use my own car. And I gotta be honest, when I did Uber and Lyft part-time, loved it. I'm like, okay, I have like other income from other sources. The Uber and Lyft was perfect to fit my schedule. As we all know, there's a lot of benefits to being a driver. You have, of course, things like instant cash outs, instantly get that money, decent hourly rate, although that's a bit debatable. We'll talk about that in a second. You have the fact, of course, the flexibility, great part-time. When I did Uber and Lyft and I drove for Uber and Lyft full-time, hated it. Now, granted, there are a lot of people, a lot of drivers I've interviewed, both offline and online, who love driving full-time. So I do want to say that, but for me, just a personal example, I hated driving full-time, and I also had my own car. I feel like maybe if I had a rental car, again, very personal, just viewpoint, if I had a rental car and I went into it every week, negative 200, I went into it in the hole, and let's say if I make $200, I technically or really just broke even, I feel like I'd get annoyed at that. Granted though, I want to stress, if let's say you have a hard time getting your own car, if let's say you don't want to put those miles and depreciation on your car, you can do that. I had a friend, for example, who had a car. She drove for Uber and she's like, you know what? I'm gonna rent a car through Uber, $200 a week, $800 a month. And the main reason why is she was driving full time. And she's like, hey, I'd much rather put all that wear and tear, the depreciation, all that kind of stuff, just beating the car into the ground on a different car, because I'm driving so much that, yeah, it is $200 a week, but because I'm driving, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, that works for me. Number 3, the average hourly rate. To be simple, straightforward, the average Uber driver and Lyft driver makes about $20 to $25 an hour on average. And here's where the math gets a bit funky and a bit tricky. Again, this comes down to the ROI like I talked about earlier when it comes to full-time versus part-time, that you kind of pretty much have to drive full-time if you're renting a car. Pretty much. Not fully, which we'll talk about in a second, but you do kind of have to drive as much as you can because, of course, you want to make it worth it. Now, let's say, to use, maybe not the worst case scenario, but the lower end of that average. Let's say you make 20 an hour. To use simple math, you're going to have to drive 10 hours in a week just to break even. At that point, anything past that is profit, which is great, but you are going to have to drive at least 10 hours just to break even on that vehicle. That is something you have to keep in mind. That's why, like I said, when it comes to this ROI, when it comes to part-time versus full-time situation, if you're only driving part-time, it might not be as worth it compared to if you are driving full-time. To use another example, let's say you're like, okay, you got the car and you have a 9 to 5 job. You're renting it though. So let's say you're like, okay, I'm gonna drive 5 hours on a Friday night, 5 hours on a Saturday night, 10 hours. You're only gonna do 10 hours of driving a week. Now on a Friday and Saturday night, the peak hours in case you didn't know, are morning and evening commutes, Friday and Saturday nights, right? So 7 to 9 a.m., 5 to 7 p.m. during the week. And on Friday and Saturday nights, you're looking at about 9 p.m. to about 2 a.m., to be honest. Maybe 3 or 4 a.m., right? But let's just say 9 to 2. Or actually, I might see 10 to 3 is probably better. Let's say 10 to 3, right? So those 5 hours right there. So let's say you drive 10 hours in a week. Well, think of this. 25 to 30 an hour, I think is a good average hourly rate for a Friday and Saturday night. So let's say you're at the upper epsilon of that. Let's say you're making 30 an hour just to make math simple. Well, after 10 hours of driving in a week, you make $300. You're making 30 an hour, $300 for 10 hours of driving. You're like, wow, I made 30 an hour. Like this is crazy. I drove only 10 hours. I only worked 10 hours. I made $300. But you didn't really, right? You made technically 100. You spent 200 to use that as an average, for example. You made 200 that went to the rental vehicle. So you really only made $100 after everything. 300 minus 200, 100. You only made really $100 in your pocket after working 10 hours. So you didn't really make 30 an hour. You made 10 an hour, right? And this is where this is where the ROI really comes into play. Now, of course, if let's say you drove more hours and everything, your hourly rate would increase if that makes sense. Because remember, your average hourly rate when it comes to renting a vehicle is going to be almost in the red or negative because you have to drive a bunch just to break even, right? But this is why I do want to mention, because keep in mind, if let's say you are looking at the full-time versus part-time situation, and you're like, you know what, Mark, I can only drive part-time, but I still think it's worth it. Well, keep in mind, like I said, the average driver does make, depending on your area, 20 to 25 an hour. One thing I would suggest, like in the comment I got earlier, they talked about New Orleans. One thing I would suggest is maybe Google New Orleans average hourly rate for Uber driver or Lyft driver. Look into that. It does change. It does fluctuate. Keep that in mind. So that is something you do want to be aware of, that there's a lot of different factors to determine how much money you can make as a driver. Your location is the number one. Like I've said in a lot of videos, your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver. So just keep this in mind, that remember, I know this is very simple math, maybe very captain obvious to some, but I do want to mention it. When it comes to the hourly rate, once you reach that threshold and you break even, anything past that's profit. But keep in mind, like I said, if like you drive 10 hours in a week, to use that example again, you drive 10 hours in a week, you make $30 an hour, which is pretty good, 30 in an hour, you have 300. But really 200 of that goes to the rental, so you only made really 10 an hour because you're only walking away with, or might as well say driving away with, $100 or $10 an hour. And also that does not include things like expenses, gas that you do have to pay for, of course taxes, and a lot more. Number 4, the terms. I'm gonna go over this pretty quick, but all I'm gonna say is this: look at the fine print, look at the terms. There are some situations where you can rent the car for, let's say, minimum a week, you can cancel anytime. There are some situations where you have to sign a contract saying, hey, you have it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You rent it, like say, a month at a time, and you're locked into that monthly rate every month. It does depend. There are even some situations, which is kind of interesting, where you only pay by the day. So let's say I rent a car for 2 weeks, but in those 2 weeks, I only drive, let's say 5 days, 2 days 1 week, 3 days the next week. I technically only pay a day rate on those days. There are some situations that are like that. Look into the fine print. You want to read this, right? Because especially when it comes to renting a vehicle, there are other factors too. Is insurance included or not? You should also have rideshare insurance. Does this rental vehicle not only have typical auto insurance included, but does it also have some type of rideshare insurance included? That's a big thing. Another thing is maintenance. Now, again, it does depend on the terms. Most rental vehicle policies, when it comes to being a rideshare driver, do include maintenance. So let's say brakes, the tires need to be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. That's really not on you, typically. But gas typically is on you, right? Again, there are so many different factors, and each term and situation is going to be a bit different. Read the terms. This is a big thing because every rental deal that's done is kind of different. And I will say, Uber and Lyft, when it comes to their terms, some of them aren't bad. I'll be honest. I've read some terms. I'm like, you know what? For what you're getting and everything, not too bad. In other cases, it can be pretty bad. You're locked into this kind of annoying contract. And like I said too, the ones that I've seen that are the best are the day ones. I've seen some that say, hey, you pay, I don't know, $60 or $80 for the day, and you could just drive as much as you want. Everything is profit to you. Nothing goes back to the rental driver or the rental company. Of course, you still have to make 60, for example, to break even. But another thing is mileage, right? Now, most situations, and this is a big one, especially for the day passes that I've seen, as you can imagine, the biggest wear and tear when it comes to a car is driving it. I know it sounds stupid, but the mileage is a big factor. Now, in most cases, because it is ride sharing, in most cases, when it comes to the mileage, what's going to happen is you get unlimited miles. So you rent it, let's say, for a week. You can drive as much as you want. If you want to put in, I don't know, a crazy amount of miles, who cares? But I have seen some caps. I have seen some caps on, like, say, day vehicles that say, $60, rent it all day, drive as much as you want, but you can only drive, I don't know, 7 miles in that one day. I don't know, I'm just making something up, right? I have no idea what your exact terms are. You want to look at this. You want to look at the fine print because it's very important. Number 5, Uber versus Lyft. This is a tricky one. So this could be a whole other can of worms. I'm going to say that. But overall, you have technically 3 different options in terms of the rental logistics regarding the apps. One, you rent a car through Uber, then you can really only drive for Uber with that car. The second option, you get a car through Lyft, and that car can only be used to drive for Lyft. So you can't really take the car that you're using for Uber and drive for Lyft. I know a lot of people have asked me, like, hey, Mark, what if behind the scenes or off the record, I did rent a car through Uber, but I drove for Lyft at the same time? I gotta be honest, I don't know how they would police that, the policies. I don't know how they would structure it. I don't know if, like, say, you drove, like, say, mostly for Uber, but you did an extra 40 miles driving for Lyft, and they do actually the math to determine, like, wait a minute, based off the math of how many miles you drove for Uber, because it is tracked, we can see there's a 40-mile discrepancy, what's going on. I don't know if they would do that. I really can't say. So I'm going to say that. Although I will say, when it comes to rental policies, typically for both Uber and Lyft, they do say you cannot drive for a competitor. You can only use a car when it comes to ride sharing to drive for Uber. How would they catch you? What would happen? I honestly don't know. But I will say, based off the terms, I'm just talking about the terms, if you rent a car through Uber, you can only rent a car through Uber. Or excuse me, drive for Uber. If you rent a car through Lyft, you can only drive with that vehicle for Lyft. Now, the third option you have, though, you may be wondering, is a third party. This is a company that, like, say, doesn't really associate with Uber directly or Lyft directly, but they'd say, hey, we're a rideshare rental company, meaning we rent out our cars not just for people who are traveling, who are maybe in the area, they want to rent a car, like Turo, you can rent a car, for example, or Hertz or Enterprise to just drive around like you're traveling or you're on vacation or whatever. We're a rental company that specifically has a program for rideshare drivers that has, like, say, unlimited miles. That has different terms than a typical rental because you're going to be using it for work, basically. You're using it for work. In those situations, I highly suggest reading the fine print. In my mind, and in my opinion, when I've read a lot of these terms and just did a lot of research, I find these third-party companies can be good in the instance that you can use it for both Uber and Lyft. Most of them say, hey, we don't care how and when you drive. Here are the terms. If you want to drive for Uber, if you want to drive for Lyft, we don't care. We're a third-party company. We're kind of outside of that arena. But sometimes these terms with these third-party companies, they're not directly related and associated with Uber and Lyft, can be a bit sketchy. So I do want to say that those are the ones that you really have to read the fine print. But in general, those are 3 different options. Number 6, Teslas. I want to put this as its own point. I've talked about this a lot when it comes to rentals and the news about Teslas regarding how you can make a lot more money. I find when it comes to rentals, there's, in my mind, 2 different categories. Pretty much every other car and then Teslas. Granted, it could be broken down more than that. But in general, that's the way I think of it. The reason why is there's been a lot of meta-analysis, a lot of studies to show that if you drive a Tesla, you can make more money with a Tesla than any other vehicle. And I know right now, at the time of this video, bringing up Teslas and everything that's going on, especially with politics, is a bit of poking that hornet's nest or opening up Pandora's box. So I will say this might change. I just want to say that. Good or bad, I honestly don't know. But I want to say this. In general, typically, it has been shown that if you rent a Tesla, you make more money. And there's been a lot of reports. There was one huge article that got written about one lady who said she doubled her income by renting a Tesla. Even though she was spending more money to rent a Tesla, she made significantly more money because one, Teslas typically could drive for the more premium options, not just Uber or Lyft, but like say the eco ones like Uber Green, for example. Also sometimes they qualify for like say like more of a luxury ride like Uber Comfort or Lyft Comfort or whatever. So there are some benefits. And then two, they have found a lot that when it comes to Teslas, people typically tip more when it comes to a Tesla than other vehicles. So these are things to keep in mind, and I want to put this as its own point because there have been a lot of drivers I've talked to here in LA, and granted, maybe it's an LA only thing, maybe it depends upon the location. There are a lot of factors to this, but I've interviewed a lot of drivers in person here who are like, yeah, man, I was using my car, or I was renting another vehicle. I decided to rent a Tesla, and it was $400 a week. $400 a week, $1,600 a month, but it's well worth it because, yeah, I have to spend more money to rent this Tesla. Definitely have to spend more money. $1,600 a week is not cheap. Or excuse me, $1,600 a month. I want to make that clear. $400 a week, $1,600 a month. $1,600 a month is not cheap, but I'm making so much more money with this Tesla. It's well worth it. And I've heard that from, if anything, I'd say 90-ish% of the drivers I've interviewed who drive a Tesla, most of them are renting it. About 10% actually own that Tesla. And the 90% of drivers that I've interviewed, to be honest, who actually rent that Tesla, rave about it. They're like, this is, if anything, I don't think, and I have to think about this, I don't think so far, knock on wood, I've heard one negative thing from someone who rented a Tesla and started driving. Everything's been positive of how much more money they can make. Now, I will say, when it comes to the terms, it is interesting with Teslas because it's a more expensive vehicle and whatnot. There are some terms, take like Uber, for example, they do have some policy. I saw one time that said you need at least 100 rides and at least like a 4.8 driver rating. So you almost have to like work your way up, so to speak, to rent that Tesla. But this is something I would suggest to look into because you could make more money. Number 7, buying a car. I want to talk with this, and I want to say this right away. Don't lease. Don't lease. So let's get that out of the way. Don't lease. I'm talking about buying a car. This is something I would look into. And the main reason why is if, let's say, you go on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, et cetera, maybe a dealership. Of course, I want to stress I'm not an expert car salesman or whatever, so I want to say that. But I know a lot of people who've bought cars on Facebook Marketplace. Of course, take the typical precautions. Bring it to a mechanic. Make sure it's checked out and inspected. Make sure the title and everything is actually the owner's name and it's effectively transferred over. Make sure you do all the stuff to word it simply when it comes to buying a car. But here's the thing. If let's say you buy a used car and you buy it for, I don't know, $6 or $7 grand. I'm just making numbers up. 6 or $7 grand, and it has a bunch of miles on it, but it's running well. And it looks good. Like one of my friends bought, I think this was a few years ago, but he bought a Prius. I think it was like 120,000 miles. I think it was like $4 or $5 grand on Facebook Marketplace. Not perfect condition, but pretty dang good. In my mind, I'd almost rather get a loan out on that, or like say if you have a credit limit for it, just put it on your credit card. And yeah, you have to pay interest on that and all that kind of stuff, whether it's a loan or the credit card, or if you have it in cash, and drive for Lyft and Uber that way. Because as opposed to spending, I think for my friend, he did put it, I think on his card, or maybe pay cash, I can't remember how he purchased it. But let's say you get a car for $5K on Facebook Marketplace, you do all this stuff, everything's perfect, and let's say you drive it. I don't know, let's say what a 5-year loan would be, depending on the interest rates, it does fluctuate, but let's say you're spending, as opposed to, I'm making something up, $150 a week trying to go through Uber or Lyft or a third party, you might only spend $150 a month, right? And then everything passes as profit. And yes, at some point, because it's a used vehicle, miles, you are going to have to worry about more depreciation in terms of more maintenance. There are other factors that are going to come into play. You might still walk away with way more money for just buying a car. So take that comment, like I showed you a couple times in this video, or I talked about a couple times in this video, where they say, hey, you know what, I'm going to New Orleans, should I rent a car? I might suggest, and again, I want to stress I'm a former accountant, but I'm not your accountant. This is not meant to be like legal advice or financial advice. But I would maybe be like, you know what? Okay, if I'm going to definitely drive for Uber and Lyft, if I'm going to use a car anyway for my own personal stuff, well, as opposed to spending $100, $200, $300 a week, I could probably spend that a month and maybe find a rental car somewhere online or through a dealership. You might walk away, or let's say drive away, with a way better deal on your hands. And I will say this, when it comes to renting versus buying, there are pros and cons on both sides. On this video, I've tried to give you, as best I can, a very objective viewpoint. And I want to say this too, when I'm talking about buying versus renting, that maybe to some people, understandably, I seem more against renting. I feel like this video probably comes off that way because I talked a lot about the negative aspects, given the financial aspects. The main reason why for me, and I want to say this point, to be very honest, this is my subjective experience, I just don't like driving for Uber and Lyft full time. I gotta be honest, I just don't like driving full time. But if you do, renting a vehicle isn't a bad option. You know, especially like say if your credit's locked up, if there's a lot of situations you're involved in that are just tricky, the barrier to entry in my mind to rent a car is a lot easier than to buy one. Not always, but I think in general. And so when it comes to you, if let's say you're considering this and you're like, hey, Mark, I love driving. I used to drive. Or let's say you're like really down for just going in all in full time and you know it's a decent hourly rate in your area and you're down for it. In general, renting a car isn't a bad idea. I got to be honest. I think renting a car for some people is amazing. And I'd say most people that I've talked to who rent a car through Uber and Lyft do love it. They're like, this is great. I just paid $200 a week. Yeah, I know it's $200 a week, but I'm driving full time. I'm making great money. I have a flexible schedule, all the benefits of Uber and Lyft. This is awesome. I know a lot of people who say that, right? But one thing I do want to say is that if I look at should you rent or not, I'm going to say probably. If you're down to drive full time, when it comes to rent or not to rent, I'm going to say yes. But then when I look at should you buy or should you rent, I got to be honest, there are a lot of benefits to just buying the car. Buying a used car and in your mind, going to it being like, hey, I'm going to drive this car into the ground. Not literally, of course, but figuratively drive it till it just isn't really worth it anymore. It's total in terms of if it needs, a repair and the repair is more than the cost of the car, maybe insurance would be a lot better on you. It's really tough to say, but I feel like I'd approach that more and buy a car because I feel like the ROI is going to be a lot higher. Again, it does depend on your situation. Every situation is different, but this is something I do want to bring up. And now a bonus point, and that is delivery driving. I want to bring this up, and I bring this up a lot as a bonus point on my videos. I think I've done this like 15 or 20 times. The bonus point is delivery driving. But for this video, this is very relevant for two different reasons I'm going to say. One, if you already have a vehicle, but it does not qualify to drive for Uber or Lyft, delivery driving is great, right? One of my friends, for example, to use a personal example, who has a two-door vehicle. In case you didn't know, if you have a four-door vehicle and it fits all the terms, you can. But if you have a two-door vehicle, even if all the other terms are complete in terms of the age of the vehicle and more, if you have two doors, you are not allowed to drive for Uber and Lyft. But if you do delivery driving, that car does qualify. So one, I feel like this is a very small instance of people, but if your car doesn't qualify for Uber and Lyft, it most likely will for delivery driving. But two is the barrier to entry for delivery driving is a lot lower. You could do it with a bicycle, with a motorized scooter. There are a lot of other benefits, and this is something I would look into potentially. Now, I have to be honest. I've done tons of videos about Uber versus Uber Eats or delivery driving versus rideshare driving and everything. I personally did not like delivery driving when I tried it. It just, the whole idea of going to the restaurant, making sure you got the right food, God forbid I forget the milkshake or the soda, you put it in your car, you want to make sure it doesn't fall over. If you get there too late and it's cold, it's not really your fault. It's just the way delivery driving works, but somehow it is your fault. There's a lot of factors. I prefer rideshare driving over delivery driving 10 times over. But I know a lot of people who love delivery driving. They're like, hey, I can have another person with me, which you can with delivery driving. You don't have to deal with people. If your car's messy, who cares? You can throw on a podcast or just throw on music or listen to whatever you want to listen to. I know some people are like, hey, I'm just going to be on a call with my friend. I'm going to FaceTime my friend while doing delivery driving. I don't have to worry about dealing with people or being polite and like, hi, how are you? How's your day? You don't have to do any of that, right? So there's pros and cons, but I do want to mention this because if you are considering renting a car through Uber and Lyft, I'm assuming, of course, you want to do some gig economy type job that has a flexible schedule, instant cash outs, has all the benefits of a gig economy job. And delivery driving, in some instances, actually pay more. Doing delivery driving like Uber Eats, Postmates, DoorDash, etc., depending on the city and different factors and layouts, can actually pay more than being a rideshare driver, right? And like I said, say you're sitting there, you're watching this video being like, again, maybe this is a small percentage, but I want to mention it. And you're like, yeah, Mark, I want to rent a car, but $200 a week to rent a car, negative $200 in the hole to drive for Uber and Lyft, doesn't seem worth it. But let's say you have a motorized scooter sitting there right in your garage, you can do Uber Eats, you can do Postmates, you can do DoorDash with a motorized scooter, but of course, you can't use that scooter for rideshare driving. This is something to keep in mind as a good backup option.